Drawing complex scenes with a lot of detail doesn't have to be an overwhelming thing, and they certainly don't have to be subjects we avoid. There is a really important technique to learn to deal with such scenes. And that technique is to learn to suggest the detail rather than to actually draw it all. That way, we can focus on drawing, a small part of the detail carefully, and then we work at creating the effect of the detail across most of the drawing, particularly in parts that are further away or not central to what we're looking at. It can be helpful to think of it's the same way we don't draw all the leaves on a tree, because that's just impossible. So we have to draw the effect of the leaves, but it's not just leaves that this principle applies to. It's every subject with overwhelming detail. So let's look at it in this urban scene. Just a few moments careful observation of our reference can really help us improve the effect of our drawing. We see so much detail here, but the reality is, when we look at a picture as complex as this, we see just a small part of it, probably in the foreground where the detail is greater, and our brain just tells us that this detail continues out in all directions without us looking at it all carefully. Our brain will focus just on a few small areas of detail and will presume that detail continues, and we'll have the sense of it without actually having to see it all. And we want to build on this when we draw, because what this means is that we can draw a smaller part of detail in more detail, and then we can draw in a more generalized sense, moving away from that. But if our brain has been able to see the smaller amount of detail that we've drawn, it will presume that same detail is in the parts of the drawing where we haven't actually drawn it. I've often had the comment on my drawings that people have zoomed in to look at all the detail, and then they've discovered the detail's not really there in most of the drawing. And I really like that comment, because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to suggest detail without having to draw it. But it's important to work out what sort of marks we have to make to capture the effect of the detail in our particular scene, in the particular objects in our reference. And so what do we have in this reference? The overwhelming impact, besides of the cathedral, is all the roofs. And so it's the detail of the roofs with all their chimneys and little gabled windows that we want to capture without having to draw them all. And what I find helpful is to think visually, what are the key shapes that I want to include? And I think in this case, a repeated key shape is this shape of the end of buildings, and how they often concertina up against each other. As well as this effect, there's also the sense of movement that these ridges give to indicate the streets, as these ridge lines are often parallel to the street. So we get a sense of order and not just a total jumble of houses. We also have lots of chimneys, as is the case with a roof line. And so I want to capture these, if you like, motifs in what I draw. And there are also lots of dormer windows that line up in a row. And so these elements are repeated over and over again. And therefore it's important that we draw many of these in detail, closer to the front, but also that we draw lines which will suggest them without becoming too detailed further back. So, conscious of this, let's start to draw. I start using a 0.5mm fine liner pen. A thicker line, as well as drawing with more detail, will simulate the effect that we have in life where closest things are seen more clearly and in more detail. So I also start in this central area because it'll be easiest to draw more detail first. That will also give me a sense of how much detail to draw, or more rather leave out, as we move further away. So I create this central area aware that it's going to have the most visual attention paid to it. It's also going to set the feeling for what extends beyond it, even if we don't draw it. So that's an important part of creating the illusion of detail that we haven't actually drawn. Also paying attention to put all these motifs in that we talked about earlier, and to draw them carefully and with greater accuracy, with more attention to the reference than I would need to do in the second half of this drawing, which in real life took about 45 minutes to draw. I'm continuing with my 0.5mm pen with the rest of what I'm calling the foreground here, these buildings in the front. I'm doing these closest buildings which have the most detail in terms of rows of windows. I'm trying to make sure I line them up reasonably straight and taking into account the perspective of the way the building is angled to the street and to me as the viewer. It's important to take this extra care with these very closest details. We won't need to worry as much further on. And then it's these trees also in the front to create a nice visual contrast to the architecture of the building. And now I can put in more detail on the closest roofs. Again, I'm drawing them more carefully with closer reference to the photo and getting the chimneys in the right places. So now I switch to a 0.3mm pen, and you can see straight away the lighter line, which also is a prompt to me that I can start to draw with a lighter touch, with a little less detail than what I've drawn in the foreground. I also don't need to be quite so fussy with the reference photo because I'm starting now to draw the effect, but I still want to create the sense of there are streets that these buildings wind alongside of, and the sense that there are little dormer windows still attached, but I'm not having to do the same degree of detail, and I can be a little more free in how I just create these roofs now to fill in the gaps that I have. I've drawn so many of them that it's actually quite easy now to use my imagination to put them in, and just referring back to my photo to make sure I'm generally in the right direction with it all. I continue to use my 0.3mm pen for the very furthest of these roofs, and these are the ones where I really am just drawing those motifs that we talked about at the start of the video. A handy trick is to really establish where the top of these lines are and then just fill down in the space that's available. The cathedral in Bern sits in the distance, and it is in the distance, so it's important to not be tempted to put too much detail, which will make it come forward than it really deserves to. I build this spire with a bit of a lean to the right, which is unfortunate. I do have a few tricks to correct it slightly, so if you compare this with the still photo at the start, you'll see how they were reasonably successful, and I might make a separate video of those tricks. So I do that, and then I've just got a few more buildings to the right of the cathedral that are quite large and prominent, so I want them to look as they do in life because they'll be recognizable to people who know Bern, but otherwise I'm just being very gestural and simple in what I draw. There's just a few more buildings now with the 0.3mm pen here on the right. Again, being fairly gestural now with these rooftops, drawing them from my imagination. Now I switch to my 0.2mm pen to draw all the buildings and the landscape that's on the far side of the cathedral. I want a really light touch here, particularly when I come to the hill on the other side. I just want to suggest a bit of a silhouette and a little bit of tone and shadows. The temptation is to try and draw too much. There are a few buildings, I do the windows incredibly lightly and keep a very, very faint touch because these things are so far in the distance and we want the cathedral to stand well and truly in front of them, and then the things in front of the cathedral to be further in front again, in effect. So here's our drawing of the city of Bern, and we've worked at not drawing all of the detail that's in our photo, but instead to draw it in the most visually prominent and closest parts of the drawing and suggesting the detail as we've moved further away. We also go from using a heavier line to a lighter line as we move away in the same way. I think it's rather effective. What do you think? It's certainly easier. G'day, I'm Travers. I hope that was helpful. If you're finding my videos helpful, please can you help me and help my channel? Subscribe, hit notifications, leave a comment. That's really important. All these things help YouTube know that this is worthwhile content and to push it out to more people. So I'd really appreciate that for me if you think this is helpful for you. But I would say this is perhaps one of my most useful and strongest personal techniques when I draw, creating the effect of detail without having to draw it all. There are so many subjects that are just overwhelming if we can't do this in some way. So give it a go. I hope you find it fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.